Yon approved Grandpa's exemption, but he didn't issue any certificate evidencing any exemption. Accordingly, on August 29, 1942, 4 months after U.S. Attorney temporarily exempted Grandpa, another review was yet conducted by yet a second Provost Marshal General. These are heavy guys, Paul R. Taylor, who issued an official certificate of exemption. Now that's great, because up to that point, we only had the one thing, and that our family was not exempted. You know, we were enemy aliens. We were exempted on Grandpa's coattails, but only by word of mouth. Wow, this is going to be a little difficult. So they also learned that when Grandpa got out of the Navy, he worked for the rich and famous. He worked for Hollywood's chairman of 20th Century Fox, Joseph Schenck, big roller. He worked for Joseph Skenk's wife, silent screen star Norma Talmadge. And then get this, he worked for the greatest entertainer in the world, Al Jolson. They loved that little guy. Now the principal cause, the tiebreaker for Grandpa's exemption, was his long and honorable service in the military. In the Navy, it's a military tradition. This is a perk that gave him the benefit of the doubt of disloyalty. And our entire family was unofficially exempted on his coattails, but still without exemption papers to prove our exemptions. Well, this would eventually lead to a crisis. So what was it like living in the restricted and prohibited military areas of the West Coast, being the only family of Japanese ancestry? Now, thank God, his wife was Creole, and the kids really didn't look Japanese. They were taken for Spanish, Hawaiian, Filipino. But although informally exempted, young 7-year-old Takashi, 14-year-old Tadashi, and 17-year-old Takeo, these are my uncles, were still required to attend public school, and that's the rub. Takashi suffered frequent insults and random fistfights in grammar school. The kids would ask him if his parents were Jap spies. His teacher would let him out of class 5 minutes early to get a head start running home because these guys would chase him home. However, one day a student's older brother and his friend waited for him outside of school. When they saw him, the older brother pulled a knife on a 7-year-old kid. And he tells Takashi, if he was a man, he would take the knife away from him. He said if he didn't try, he would cut off Takashi's hand like the Japs do to American soldiers. 7 years old. Takashi was a fast runner and ran for his life, and he hid at some bushes. The boys knew he was somewhere, and they said, a dirty Jap is hiding, and if we catch him, we're going to beat the SHIT out of him. Thank God no one ever caught that kid. Now, 15-year-old Tadashi had issues with his fellow students, but worse, he had trouble from his mean-spirited, intolerant teacher. In front of the class, the teacher would taunt Tadashi by saying, why don't you washi, Tadashi? Inferring that he was a dirty you-know-what. Now, 17-year-old Takeo, the older of the three, had no choice but to quit high school to help the family financially, because Dad was fired, Grandpa was fired. He didn't have any income coming in outside of Grandpa's $74 a month naval retirement. And you can't get too far on that. So he got a job, Takeo got a job driving heavy trucks and to put food on the table. The whole family was surviving off Grandpa's monthly retirement, again, of $74. Now, in September 1942, Takeo and his brother, Yoshio, left for Bakersfield, California in an old T-model Ford. Well, it wasn't too old back then. Yoshio went to Bakersfield to propose marriage to my mother's sister, Florestina, and took along an engagement ring and a bottle of champagne. A truck hauling overhanging pipes on the 99 highway, the Ridge Route, with no flag, suddenly stopped in front of them, and they crashed into it. And close your ears on this. Takeo was thrown out the window and lay unconscious while Yoshio was impaled by the pipes of the truck. They were both still alive and breathing when the police and the medics arrived, but when they saw their Japanese names and the boys had no exemption papers, they assumed they were runaways from the prison camps. Now, and they covered them up as dead. They were still alive. That was, okay. General DeWitt had recently reported in the press that all Japanese were removed from the West Coast, except for a few sick Japanese. This is true in hospitals who were under guard. Okay. Again, only Grandpa had exemption papers, but not the family. The boys were then transported to a hospital in Bakersfield, by which time Yoshio had died of his untreated wounds, and the staff then placed Yoshio in a morgue in a drawer. And then they inhumanely placed Takeo in the morgue in a drawer, even though he was still breathing and his body was warm. They were just crazy. Such was the hatred of the Japanese at that time. Grandma had to come from Los Angeles to identify the bodies. And while massaging Takeo's forehead, he suddenly moved. She gave, with her Florida temper, Creole temper, she gave them holy hell and took him to a hospital where he woke up from the coma 3 weeks later. Yoshio was buried in an unmarked grave because the family couldn't afford a headstone. However, 72 years later, relocated his grave in Bakersfield, California, and installed a headstone on it. Now, Takeo subsequently enlisted in the Army. He was assigned to the Hawaiian 100th Division, who merged with the 442nd, the legendary 442nd Battalion, and earned the Bronze Star Combat Infantry Badge. Now, to get the Combat Infantry Badge, you have to be shooting at somebody and holding terrain. Officers would try to fly over the combat zone and say, "Hey, I was there." Were you shooting? Did you hold any ground? No. Sorry, no Combat Infantry Badge. He also was given the Chevalier French Medal of Honor, the highest decoration bestowed by France, and lastly, the Congressional Gold Medal. Of course, all the 442 boys got that. Fantastic. Now, vigilante violence was rampant in the streets, with murder, robbery, rape, and police were lax in prosecuting assailants. Dad had almond-shaped eyes and had some near scrapes with violence. However, nothing really seriously happened to Dad. We had lived in our neighborhood since 1935, and all the neighbors knew us and never bothered us. Once a vandal must have heard the Japanese lived in our house and threw a rock through the bay window. However, we were very lucky and fortunate enough to have feel like this. Living amongst vigilante violence, one day a shore patrol vehicle pulls up in front of our house and skids. And Grandpa's sitting at the window as he says, "Oh my God, they're coming to take us away." So they knocked on the door, he invited them in, and he says, "Oh, come. I served you coffee and pastries." "Oh, well, thank you. It's pretty cold outside and it's raining." Well, finally they says, "Well, is your family here?" No. "Well, where are they?" Blah, blah, blah. He said, "Well, we're interested in renting a room from you. And did Grandma say no? No, she didn't. Now, I don't know if the Navy put them up to it or not, because they knew that we were the only family of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast, basically, outside of the prison camps. And the officers would protect us from vigilante violence if that should occur. Talk about being lucky in the breaks that my family got during World War II. It is incredible. So the family members got menial work. Dad got a job at Bullock's department store. Grandma and Mom were hired by an assembly line plant. And Grandpa got a job in Hollywood at a pressing plant for military records. And every morning, though, before Grandpa got on the streetcar that stopped at the corner of our house on 43rd and McKinley Street in East Los Angeles, Grandma would take a few minutes to pray for his safety, because he was going to get on this streetcar. A person of Japanese ancestry. Whoa. How long was he going to survive? Nothing ever happened. They never did bother him. Of course, his features were such that he could probably pass for Chinese, maybe a fair-skinned Filipino, but they never bothered him, not a one time. Amazingly, he was never harassed by anyone. When Uncle Takeo came home on leave, Grandpa would put on his Navy petty officer's uniform and they would walk down the street to the local watering hole, American Legion. You know, military guys and booze, where they were members. Now, this is kind of funny. Army servicemen walking down the street, unfamiliar with Navy insignia, would salute Grandpa. And he would return the salute, and him and Takeo would sniggle. Okay, now, what are we going to do? We're out here exempted. Can we do anything constructive? Well, yes, we could. Now, again, Dad was a firebrand. He was a muckraker. He didn't mind protesting. Now, since all the Japanese gardeners and landscapers were in prison, Dad got work in these high-end gardening positions as a gardener and a landscaper in an exclusive suburb of Los Angeles. Now, he confided in the customer, Dan Marshall, and some of you may remember it. Dan Marshall had some landmark cases that he won for discrimination. He was the president of the Catholic Interracial Council of Los Angeles and a noted civil rights attorney. He told him that he was half Japanese, and it popped his cork. Dan, he says, what? He was amazed that he was not in prison and pursuant to the one drop of blood rule, and that was the standard. If you had one drop of blood, you're going to camp, no doubt about it. So, and he was more than shocked when he heard that the family was also exempted. Now, this was not the racist army that Dan Marshall knew. A very, very devoted Christian. Dan asked if he might be willing to help, if Dad might be willing to help the council apply the Christian works of mercy. Now, what is that? The works are feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless, visiting the prisoners, attempting to ransom the captives, and clothing the naked. I don't think anybody is walking around the camps naked, but that's part of the Catholic works of mercy. The council was not allowed to enter the prison camps to perform the works. And even evangelist Dorothy Day, some of you may remember Dorothy Day. You would, yes. They wouldn't let Dorothy Day in the camp. And she is being currently canonized for sainthood, that's right. And how is she doing on that, Nancy? She doing okay on that, canonization? Yeah.
It's coming along. I think she's beatified and it will be done.
Fantastic. She was tremendous. My God. So they wouldn't let Dorothy Day go in there to work with the prisoners. Now, Dan, the attorney, what he wanted to do was try to promote the early release of the Japanese from the detention centers and to facilitate their return to the West Coast by having Dad speak at anti-Japanese forums and rallies. And Dad really had to think about that. Boy, my neck, you know. So even though Dad and our mixed family were excluded from Japanese society, he yet assented to give pro-Japanese speeches as one who never left the West Coast. Further, one who is not engaged in deliberately destroying power plants, ordnance works, factory plants because of the influence of his Japanese blood. They actually believe this crap. His mantra was that the Japanese Americans were 200% American, loyal to the United States and can be trusted. And that was so true, as there wasn't one shred of evidence of any espionage against any Japanese during the entire war period or afterwards. So he gave a speech to the Kiwanis Club. Now the Kiwanis Club is a good place to start. They have over 300,000 members. Whoa! In 8,000 clubs in 70 countries. And I don't think it went over too well at the Kiwanis Club. They did not want the Japanese released from camps and to come back to the West Coast. Now, this was very interesting. The council also approached the eminent Bishop of San Diego. Now, here was an incredible Catholic priest, bishop, Charles Francis Buddy. an incredible builder. He created 150 new parishes, 30 mission chapels, 75 elementary schools, a Catholic newspaper, and created the University of San Diego. He also built a church for African Americans, and in that time that was pretty bold. So here was a holy man. The bishop could be more than helpful if the council could get his support in speaking up for the Japanese and against the internment. The council thus pled their case to Bishop Buddy, who was known as the Throne of Grace, for mercy for any alleged failure, if any, of the Japanese in their hour of need. And if any such Japanese had sinned, then the spiritual ones among us should quietly set them back on the right path. After all, Jesus came to save sinners, not to punish them. However, the bishop took a hard line against the Japanese and said he didn't want them back either. This really torqued Ted, who was part of the interracial council. In fact, the city of San Diego had just passed a resolution against their return. Now, the meeting nearly turned violent. I have my dad on tape telling this story. As Ted, a seriously devoted Catholic and columnist against racism for the Los Angeles Daily News, he threatened to take off his coat and told the bishop if he would take off his cloak, they would settle the matter. Ted went to church every day. He worked for a newspaper, but he went across the street and spent some time in the church saying prayers. Very, very spiritual. Dad had a real hard time calming him down, but they finally got him calmed down and went back to Los Angeles. Now, the next stop was the city of Pasadena. In 1944, the Army released 19-year-old Esther Takei from Granada War Detention Center as a test case for resettling the Japanese.
Jeez.
She was to quietly enroll at Pasadena City College. However, the college editor leaked her intentions to the press, which created chaos and pandemonium. It became one of the biggest anti-Japanese protests ever, drawing numerous anti-Japanese groups, cars up and down the street, driving up and down the street, honking their horns, people shouting racist signs ad nauseum. Now, Esther was even spit on and slapped by an elderly woman at a bus stop, and was thereafter prevented from attending any of the public protests. So, this was Dad's biggest protest, to come out for this girl. So Dad and the council spoke up for her at the Pasadena Library before several hundred dissidents and rabble-rousers. I mean, he really put his neck on the line. In the final analysis, yay, I'm going to say yay, Dr. John Sexton, superintendent of public schools in Pasadena, stated, quote, "The protests against Ms. Takei's admission were not in conformity with our American way, or in accord with the dictates of reasonableness and sound judgment." Close quote. And in spite of the massive opposition to her return, the Pasadena Board of Education ruled that, quote, "We have no power to expel Mrs. Takei," unquote. Protests eventually declined, and Esther continued her education without further incident. So at last, will our family members be exempted under the Army's new mixed marriage policy? What the heck is that? I remember when I was writing my book, I ordered a lot of documents from the National Archives, all of them. And it says, oh, this family is part of the mixed marriage policy. What's that? And then I fully researched it and found out it was one of DeWitt's projects. Okay, so my father wrote a letter in 1942 to General DeWitt asking for his and Grandpa's jobs back. He told DeWitt, listen, the first generation Japanese, the ISSEI, it banished and disowned Japanese in mixed marriages, giving them the same standing as gaijin, foreigners. Accordingly, that was our situation. We were gaijin, excommunicated from Japanese social life. DeWitt replied that a mixed marriage is no measure of loyalty and no guarantee of national security. Now, it should be noted that General DeWitt, he was not thought well of at all.